Amy Goodman is the host and executive producer of Democracy Now! Democracy Now! Is an award-winning daily news program that airs on over 900 television and radio stations throughout North America. And because Democracy Now! Does not depend on corporate underwriting, Amy and her team are able to present a range of opinions seldom heard on the air. The role of reporters, Amy says, is to go where the silence is and say something. Dissent, she believes, is what makes this country healthy. Amy has exemplified that ideal by going, often at considerable risk, to places like Nigeria, Peru, and Haiti to report on stories that are often ignored by the mainstream media. Amy has received numerous awards, including the Robert F. Kennedy Journalism, George Polk, and Overseas Press Club Awards. She has also received the Right Livelihood Award for developing an innovative model of truly independent grassroots political journalism that brings to millions of people the alternative voices that are often excluded by the mainstream media. Fellow journalist Danny Schechter said, "Amy works hard, and when she's not working, she works harder. She is informed, committed, passionate, thorough, and very uncompromising." Goodman is, Schechter says, in a class of her own. And like me, if at times you feel completely overwhelmed by the news of the day, there is something so comforting, so reassuring, and so true about her calm, steady voice. Please join me in giving a huge Connecting for Change welcome to Amy Goodman.
Oh, it's so wonderful to see all of you. I just want to warn you, if by chance I get struck by a coughing fit, which sometimes comes on me unexpectedly, use the moment to stand up, stretch, do whatever. Don't get alarmed. I'll get my breath back in a minute. And there are wonderful Marion Institute volunteers who are going to be handing out our daily digest. That is a way to sign up your email address, and you get our daily headlines every day and the stories and news alerts, and it's a wonderful way to stay in touch. I can't tell you how excited I am to be here in New Bedford. And I took a wonderful tour last night after the dinner and went to Frederick Douglass's house. To be here in New Bedford, I hope that people who come from outside, and even here, maybe you haven't gotten a chance to tour where he lived, but last night I touched on Frederick Douglass's life, and today I'd like to go a little further for starters, because he teaches us such lessons. I write a column every week that's called Breaking the Sound Barrier. And oh, by the way, I'm working with Baker Books here. They're from Dartmouth. Independent bookstores are our saviors. All over the country, thousands have been shuttered in this time of recession, and especially in a time when corporations take over the smaller bookstores. But I hope you support them, because they are oases of dissent. Just like libraries, you can go in and lose yourself, journey through time, through people's perspectives all over the world. We must support independent bookstores everywhere. But this column I do, we put into a book called Breaking the Sound Barrier, and I wrote about Frederick Douglass. I've often referred to him. because of what he teaches us. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has and it never will. Frederick Douglass. Well, let me go back a little further. Right after President Obama was elected, when he was President-elect Obama, I was invited on to CNN to talk about the significance of a particular day when the Obamas were going to the White House. They weren't yet, Obama wasn't yet president, but they were meeting with the Bushes. So I'm in the CNN studios, and there are other people in other insert studios around the country, and they're commenting, and I'm seeing the Obamas walk into the White House. And they're chattering the other pundits about something or other, and I said, wait a minute. And they asked me about something else, the host on the air. I said, wait, we have to take pause here. Because what we're seeing on the TV screen, Barack Hussein Obama, Michelle LaVaughn Robinson Obama are walking into the White House. Michelle LaVaughn Robinson Obama, the descendant of slaves, and so their daughters, Sasha and Malia, are the descendants of slaves, are walking into the White House, the most famous house on earth, which was built by slaves. Let's just take pause. What an historic moment. The night that Obama was elected, I think the whole world heaved a sigh of relief. But what does it mean when the community organizer-in-chief becomes the commander-in-chief? Who are going to be the community organizers now? I mean, the good thing is that parents all over the country are saying, you know, oh, to their kids, maybe you could be a community organizer too. That's a positive thing. But what happens when all of those movements that gathered together, I mean, I really do think that, among others, President Obama was elected by the anti-war movement. I mean, he was hardly different from Hillary Clinton, except in one way. He was opposed to the war in Iraq, and Hillary Clinton hung on to that war to the very end till she saw this was not going to win her the election, and then she said she was sorry the way she voted for war in the Senate. The anti-war movement, and yet, what do we see almost 4 years later? We see Obama's war in Afghanistan. Instead of ending the war, he committed to a surge in the war, which shocked so many. Or any number of issues. As I said last night, under President Obama, more than 1 million immigrants have been deported, more than any president in history. Guantanamo wasn't closed. The whole issue of accountability of those who engaged in torture. The idea of that President Obama has suggested, just look forward, we don't look back. I actually don't even think he believes that, because history informs where we are, and if there isn't accountability, then mistakes will be repeated. But so here they are walking into the White House, this historic moment. And I couldn't help but think of another house not far from there, actually a couple of hours from there, and that is on the eastern shore of Maryland. See, Frederick Douglass was born on the eastern shore of Maryland. He was enslaved as a youth and a teenager, and it might not surprise you to know he was a troublesome slave. And so he was handed over to a man named Ed Covey, who was a slave breaker. Ed Covey's property was called Mount Misery, and Frederick Douglass was beaten there. Frederick Douglass was tortured there until he fought back, headed north, and changed the world. He actually headed, and I'm looking at New Bedford's Historical Society information, which is wonderful. On September 3rd, 1838, dressed as a mariner and carrying another man's seaman's protection papers, Frederick Douglass, then Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey, boarded a train in Baltimore, Maryland. He was 20 years old. The young fugitive arrived in Havre de Grace in Maryland. Then he crossed the Susquehanna River by ferry and boarded another train bound for Wilmington, Delaware. In Wilmington, Frederick Bailey took a steamboat to Philadelphia, then a train to New York City. In less than 24 hours, Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey had escaped slavery. when he got to New York, he went to the printing press of a man named David Ruggles, born a free black man in Connecticut. It's in the lower end of Manhattan. It exists today as an independent coffee shop, which I love to go to, and I think part of its magic is knowing this history. And there, Frederick Douglass took refuge. You know that Frederick Douglass went on to speak all over the country against slavery and his power when he went to Nantucket, for example, after New Bedford, when he started to speak out against slavery publicly, he shook when he spoke because he was speaking from his own experience. He started the North Star newspaper. David Ruggles had a printing press. They saw the media as their form of liberation because information is power. But back to Mount Misery, where he was beaten and then escaped. Mount Misery today is owned by Donald Rumsfeld. He bought it as his vacation home in 2003 to be near his close friend, Vice President Dick Cheney. Yes, the Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld. And when I learned that, I was so totally shocked. I was reading about it, and research on the internet. But as a journalist, you know, you have to see these kind of things for themselves. And so I went with my colleague, Dennis Moynihan, who I write the weekly columns with. And your local paper, by the way, wherever you live, can run the weekly column. Our whole idea is to bring out the voices of people not usually heard, to provide a roadmap in the mainstream media to independent media and independent voices all over the world. And the column is carried by newspapers and websites all over. So we wrote about this journey. I went down to St. Michael's, Maryland. I thought, is it conceivable that Donald Rumsfeld's vacation home is Mount Misery, where Frederick Douglass was tortured? So we drove into St. Michael's, and I realized I had no idea where the Secretary of Defense lived. So we see this organic coffee shop ahead of us, and I think, oh, they'll tell the truth. So we went inside, and they said, what would you like? And I said, I'd like to know where Donald Rumsfeld lives. They said, oh, just drive out back. You go down the road. You'll hit Mount Pleasant Road. Don't go down that road. Make a right and another right, and you'll hit Mount Misery Road. Go down the road, and he's at the end of it. So we get in the car. We don't go down Mount Pleasant Road. We make a right and another right. It seems we couldn't go right enough. But then we went down the road, and there we see the black-tinted windows on the SUV of the Secret Service, and we know we have arrived. So I get out very quickly with my video camera, and I am filming. And as I'm filming, I'm thinking, does Donald Rumsfeld know the significance of this property? And as I'm filming, I zoom in on the stake in the ground that says Mount Misery, as the authorities are zooming out. So we knew we better leave quickly. And so we went over to an old black church. This was Sunday morning, an ancient church on a dusty road. And I went inside, and folks were just about the service was just about to begin. They were having Sunday school in the sanctuary. And I went up to him and I said, excuse me, I'd just like to know if you could comment. You know, we just came down here. This is such a historic place. It was where Frederick Douglass was born. He was enslaved here. He was beaten at Mount Misery, and now Donald Rumsfeld owns Mount Misery, who himself is known for torture. And I was just wondering if you could talk about the significance of this place. And she said, I can't comment right now. We're in church. Well, from Mount Misery to Mount Hope. A few years ago, I was telling this story up near Geneva, New York, at a school. And a young woman came up to me after, just like people came up to me after the talk last night to say, do you know where you are? And it's true in Geneva, too, which is right near Rochester. And she said, could I take you to Frederick Douglass's grave? I said, oh, my gosh, I'm flying out to Denver in the morning. And we were in the middle of a snowstorm, and she said, please. So I said, okay, I'll meet you at 5 in the morning in front of this cemetery called Mount Hope, and then I have to race off to the airport. So there she was in her parka, covered with snow. We sloshed over to the gravesite of Frederick Douglass, the tombstone. We brushed the snowflakes off his tombstone, and it was amazing. And then she said, please, would you come with me? I want to show you one more tombstone. I said, oh my God, I'm going to miss. Okay. So we raced across a very large cemetery, and there was the tombstone of Susan B. Anthony, who's buried next to her sister. You know, Susan B. Anthony and Frederick Douglass were not just allies, they were friends. When I told this story at Wesleyan College, a woman came up and said, and did you visit Susan B. Anthony's house? Because right near there is a statue of, not of generals, but of Susan B. Anthony and Frederick Douglass having tea together. See, Susan B. Anthony was not just a feminist, suffragist. She supported the abolition movement. She was against slavery. And Frederick Douglass was not just against slavery. He was a great fighter for women's rights. He seconded the resolution at the 1848 Seneca Falls Women's Rights Convention for women to have the right to vote in 1848, even when other women were not so sure. There was Frederick Douglass standing up for women. Frederick Douglass, Susan B. Anthony, the women's rights movement, the abolition movement, the civil rights movement. These are the movements that have made our country great. So that morning, I race off to the airport at Rochester, and I miss my plane. So, which I don't intend to do today. I'm heading to Louisville to talk about civil liberties tonight, to Kentucky. But at the airport, I'm desperate. I call up Dennis Moynihan, who writes the column with me, and I say, I got to get on the next plane. They're going to kill me in Denver. He brings up the blueprints of the airport, and he says, are you in the Susan B. Anthony terminal or in the Frederick Douglass terminal? I said, this is no time to joke around. I need to get on the next plane. He said, no, I'm not kidding. I said, what are you talking about? And then I look, and there to my right is the Susan B. Anthony terminal, and there to my left, I see just very small letters, Frederick Douglass. You know, every once in a while you have to stop and smell the coffee, as you all know being here. Appreciating your surroundings, understanding the historic place you are in New Bedford, and being charged up by that and moving forward. So anyway, I got onto the next plane and I made my flight. These movements are what make this country great. I don't have much time and I have a few stories to tell, so I want to move on to the importance of ensuring that you get information, and that means ensuring journalists' ability to provide that information. I want to go back to the Republican Convention of 2008. It was the first day, Labor Day, September 1st, 2008. And we had just come from Denver. That was where Obama was nominated. There were major protests there as well at the Democratic Convention. And this is very important as we move into the next conventions in 2012. And then we went to the Republican Convention. 10,000 people marched from the St. Paul Convention Center to the Excel Center. It was a beautiful blue sky day right before the convention was beginning in the evening. This was the convention that would nominate Sarah Palin and John McCain. So they marched, and they were led by soldiers in uniform. Some of them in uniform. They take great risks to do this. Some had refused to serve. Others had fought. They'd come back and said, these wars in Iraq and Afghanistan are wrong. And many thousands of civilians followed, and they marched. And we were covering that. And then I went inside to the convention later that day to cover the delegates. And my colleagues went back to the public access TV station where we were broadcasting from to digitize tape. And by the way, a big shout out to New Bedford Public Access, Channel 95. Democracy Now! Broadcasts there every day live, Monday through Friday from 8 to 9. And I hope you do tune in. It's Channel 95 right here in New Bedford. And also, we handed out little cards that show other places we broadcast. We're broadcasting on close to 1,000 stations now, from the greenest internet TV radio studios in the country in New York with platinum LEED certification. We believe the medium is the message. And you can find your station, if you're not already watching or reading or listening online, at democracynow.org by going to our website and checking out your station. Support your local community station Public radio, television station, public access station, these are sanctuaries of dissent that must be protected. You know, I come originally from Pacifica Radio, which was founded in 1949 by a war resistor named Lou Hill in the Bay Area, who refused to fight in World War II, came out of the detention camps and said there's got to be a media outlet that's not run by corporations that profit from war, but run by journalists and artists. As the late dean of the Annenberg School of Communications at University of Pennsylvania, George Gerbner said, not run by corporations that have nothing to tell and everything to sell that are raising our children today. And so the first Pacifica station was born, 59. 59, KPFK in Los Angeles. The first station was KPFA in Berkeley. 1960, WBAI in New York. 1977, WPFW in Washington. 1970, KPFT in Houston. KPFT in Houston is the only radio station in the country that's been blown up. It went on the air in 1970, 40 years ago. They were broadcasting for a few weeks. The Klan strapped dynamite to the base of the transmitter and blew it to smithereens. And when they got back on their feet, rebuilt the transmitter, the Klan blew it up again. I can't remember if it was the Grand Dragon or the Exalted Cyclops, because I often confuse their titles. But he said it was his proudest act. And I think that's because he understood how dangerous Pacifica is, how dangerous independent media is, because it allows people to speak for themselves. And when you hear someone speaking from their own experience, whether it's a Palestinian child or an Israeli grandmother, an aunt in Afghanistan, an uncle in Iraq, you start to say, that sounds like my brother, my baby, my mother. And while you may not agree with them, you begin to understand where they are coming from. And that's the beginning of peace and understanding. I think the media can be the greatest force for peace on earth. Unfortunately, it has been wielded as dangerous as any bomb, as a weapon, to rev up stereotypes and caricatures. But when you hear someone speaking for themselves, it breaks down the stereotypes that fuel the hate groups. We need a media that tells the truth, that provides a forum, a microphone, for people to describe their own experiences. And that's what we're trying to build all over the country and around the world. And I know you, many of you, young people interested in being journalists, I highly encourage you to go into that, to be there, to document your communities, to describe what you are, how you are living. It's why we're seeing this huge surge in the Occupy Wall Street, Occupy Everywhere movement, is because people are understanding that what is happening now does not serve them, does not serve most people. That is why the refrain, we are the 99%, that is echoing across the political spectrum, why it is catching fire not only in this country and around the world, and why it's critical that we be there in the streets to document this, which brings me back to the Republican Convention, September 1st, 2008. I'm on the convention floor. My colleagues are in the public access TV station like New Bedford's public access, and they're preparing the show for the next day. And then I get a call from our senior producer, Mike Burke. He says, come quickly. Sharif and Nicole have been arrested. They've been bloodied by the police. They're at 7th and Jackson. I was completely taken aback. There I was interviewing delegates from the hottest state, from Alaska. And I thought they were in the TV studio. I race out with our cameraman, who is Rick Rowley of Big Noise Films, incredibly brave journalist who goes to Iraq and Afghanistan. Watch all Big Noise films. They are fantastic. We race down the street. I've got my top security credentials on. You know, they're the ones that allow me to interview presidents and vice presidents and delegates, be on the convention floor. We're rushing to this parking lot that's at 7th and Jackson. There I see the riot police lined up. They fully contained the area. They were just standing there. So I come up quickly, and I stop at one of the police officers, and I say, sir, I need to speak to your commanding officer. I've just come from the convention floor. You can see my credentials. My 2 colleagues have been arrested. They are credentialed reporters like I am. We need to have them released. It wasn't seconds before they ripped me through that line, twisted my arms back, slapped the handcuffs on, threw me up against the wall and onto the ground. I was saying, don't arrest me. You can see I'm a journalist. I'm begging to find Nicole and Sharif. Where are they? I need them brought to me. I see Sharif across the parking lot, his arms behind his back. Finally, I'm brought to him. He's got his credentials on. We're standing loudly proclaiming, we are journalists, you know you must arrest us. There are scores of police there. And then the Secret Service came over and ripped the credentials from around our necks. So then the police take me into the police van where I'm going to be taken off to jail. And there is Nicole. She's in the van, her face is bloodied, she's got her credentials on, and she's handcuffed. She told me quickly what had happened. They were in the TV studio, they heard a commotion outside, they went to do their job. If they'd stayed inside, they wouldn't have been doing their job. She grabbed the camera, Sharif had grabbed the microphone. Nicole Salazar was our multimedia producer, Sharif Abdel-Quddus, our senior producer. You may, if you're a regular listener or viewer of Democracy Now!, know his astounding reporting from Tahrir this past year. So Nicole said, we raced downstairs, I started filming. She said, the riot police started coming at us, and they were shouting, on your face, on your face. She hadn't planned to film her own violent arrest, but there she was, holding the camera, filming, putting up her press pass, saying, press, press. And they took her down on her face. And they put their knee or boot in her back. They're dragging on her legs, so they're bloodying her face. The camera tumbles to the ground, and the first thing they do is pull the battery out of her camera. If you were wondering what it was, they wanted to stop happening. Sharif is telling the rioting police to calm down. They take him, throw him up against the wall, kick him twice in the chest, and bloody his arm and take him down. They faced felony riot charges. I was charged with a misdemeanor, interfering with a peace officer. If only there was a peace officer in the vicinity. So they take me to the police garage where they've erected cages to put the protesters in. Sharif and Nicole are taken to jail. I'll tell you, the reason we got out after hours was because of grassroots response. The videotape of my arrest and Nicole's arrest went viral. It was the most watched YouTube video for the first 2 days of the Republican convention. There was such an enormous response. The authorities in St. Paul, Minneapolis, tens of thousands of people wrote in, tweeted, emailed, called, that we were soon released. Sharif was in a cell with the AP photographer. They arrested more than 40 reporters that week. And Sharif got out before the AP photographer. So I'm taken off to the convention because networks want to interview me what happened. And I'm in the NBC skybox. I'm describing what happened. The camera interview is over. And a producer comes over and says, I don't get it, NBC producer. Why wasn't I arrested, he said. I said, oh. I said, were you out covering the protests? And he said, no. I said, well, you know, I'm not getting arrested in the skybox either. See, as Woody Allen says, 90% of life is just showing up. You've got to get out there. And by the way, congratulations, everyone, for showing up. You've got to get out there. It's our job to be on the convention floor, to cover everything that is happening there, to be in the corporate suites, to see who's sponsoring the Republican Governors Association, like the Koch brothers, to see who's sponsoring the Democratic Senate Campaign Committee, just to get information out, and to be in the streets where thousands of uninvited guests are. See, democracy is a messy thing, and it's our job to capture it all. And we shouldn't have to get a record when we put things on the record. So we sued. I don't have much time, and I want to tell the story quickly. We sued the police authorities in Minneapolis and St. Paul and the Secret Service. Last week, we held a news conference at Occupy Wall Street announcing the settlement. Sharif flew back from Egypt. Nicole came from Cambridge, where she's doing urban planning at MIT. And we just came back from Minneapolis, where we negotiated with the police and the Secret Service, and we won a landmark settlement for our arrests in 2008. In addition to the six-figure financial settlement, we won a commitment that the St. Paul Police, working with Democracy Now!, working with Center for Constitutional Rights and the ACLU, will set up a training for their police officers on how to deal with the media. It is absolutely key. And the Minneapolis police and the state enforcement authorities are supposed to follow suit. It is absolutely critical, because this is not only a violation of freedom of the press. When you can't get information, this is a violation of the public's right to know We must insist that reporters be able to operate freely, and the reason we held the news conference announcing the settlement at Occupy Wall Street, because of what we saw the police doing there, that the telling people who are videoing to stop, to turn off their video cameras, that is unacceptable. That's when you must turn on your video camera, and good police officers everywhere know this. They know it protects them as well, and many have come up to me to say this, how important this is. It is absolutely critical that we shed light on every issue. It's why Democracy Now! Was in Copenhagen for 2 weeks, broadcasting from the Climate Change Summit last year. Often again, more important to be out in the streets where so many thousands of environmental groups all over the world have gathered to pressure, to make demands about the fate of the planet. And then we went to Bolivia for the People's Summit, and then to Cancun to cover the UN Climate Change Summit, and we're headed to Durban. I hope you all tune in December, the whole Democracy Now! Team. We're the only national broadcast who broadcasts every day the full broadcast from these summits, because the fate of the Earth is in the balance. As we wrap up, I wanted to talk about the importance of a date that is coming up, and also the importance of what has sparked the protests all over the country. Mayor Bloomberg, as Occupy Wall Street began, says he hopes the students who don't have jobs are not inspired by the riots in Egypt and Tunisia. The riots. I hardly think his view is a majority view, because those who are for peace, who are for democracy, who are against war and against torture, are not a fringe minority, not even a silent majority, but the silenced majority, silenced by the corporate media, which is why we have to take the media back. As we were covering Tahrir and the uprising in Egypt that has inspired so many all over the world, Sharif was on the ground. Sharif, our senior producer, now our correspondent in Egypt. He is a son of Egypt. He flew home that week of January as we saw everything unfolding, could not believe his eyes. So many for so long had suffered. They had no idea they could actually wield this kind of power. Sharif is the grandson of the most famous writer in Egypt, Hassan Abdel Qaddous. Sharif's name is Sharif Abdel Qaddous. And for him to come home, for him to fly right from the United States basically into Tahrir. And when the internet was taken down by Mubarak. You know, Sharif has a joke about this. He says that was Mubarak's fatal error, because normally, he says, we Egyptians would be inside Facebooking, tweeting, doing all our thing. Suddenly the internet's down, we have to go outside and see what's happening. So they all go to Tahrir. But when the internet's down, we have always been on the cutting edge of internet communications at Democracy Now! Necessity is the mother of invention. We send our video, broadcast quality video, through the internet because we couldn't afford the $1 million satellites that the networks were using. And we didn't want to pay, for example, when we were covering the Iraq War and Saddam was there, we didn't want to do like CNN and the other networks did, pay Saddam millions of dollars to use the satellites. So we used a special program. Jeremy Scahill and Jackie Swin would go into the internet cafe. It was a split program. They would send 150 emails of a video report, and we would piece them back together in New York. And the same in Egypt. When the internet was down, Sharif figured out a back-end way to tweet. He became a top tweeter in the world, bringing out the voices of people at Tahrir. And when the networks, when the thugs took down the satellites, we're used to, and the internet came back up, we're used to sending video through the internet. So when CNN had Anderson Cooper reporting on Skype, looking a little like Democracy Now! From a hotel room where it said, reporting from an undisclosed location, Sharif is broadcasting for all the networks from the middle of Tahrir, saying who he was, saying exactly where he was. He said it was the safest place on the planet at that point, in the middle of 1 million people who were fighting for their freedom. And he would send 25-minute reports, and you would all meet and can meet if you want to go online and check it out. Oh, Hadef Souef, the great Egyptian writer who wrote Map of Love, standing in Tahrir, or Nawal Saadawi, the 79-year-old Egyptian feminist who'd been imprisoned under Sadat, who'd been in exile under Mubarak, who had run for president. And you're hearing her speak. Hadef Souef, when Mubarak went down, we called her up and she said, my God, I was just with 2 very pregnant women in Tahrir, and now they can give birth in freedom. And you met the high school student, the young woman, who in the shadow of the huge buildings of the state media is putting out her tabloid Voices of Tahrir, the broadsheet. You were meeting the people themselves. This was a community like your own who were experiencing their own power. As Frederick Douglass said, power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has and it never will. And in those last days before Mubarak fell, as Dennis and I were writing our column on these remarkable gatherings that were leading to liberation all over the world, we saw that Karim Amr had disappeared. He's a young blogger in Egypt. He'd already been in prison for 4 years, but he was in Tahrir, and then we saw no one could find him. And so we went on his Facebook page, on his blog, to see was there any indication. It turned out he was in a desert prison. He had already been captured again. And we were shocked to see on his blog who he had dedicated the blog to at the top. Sophie and Hans Scholl. How many of you know who they are? They're a brother and sister in World War II in Germany. And Hans and Sophie, as the Nazis rose to power and were committing their atrocities, didn't know what they could do. They weren't Jewish, they were German Christians, and they thought the best we can do is put out information so the Germans will never be able to say we didn't know. And they formed the White Rose Collective with some of their professors and other workers. And they started to print these pamphlets. They printed 6 in all. And on the 4th was written, "We will not be silent." These pamphlets were distributed all over. They would be dropped in the middle of a night in a courtyard or at a fruit stand, in the market, in the middle of a classroom, in the middle of the night. Ultimately, Hans and Sophie were captured by the Nazis, along with their professor. They were charged, they were tried, they were convicted, and they were beheaded. But that philosophy, that motto, should be the Hippocratic oath of the media today. We will not be silent. Democracy now.